Good morning. As we continue our year-long study of Go and Do, we've moved into March, and now we're going to look at this month, the idea of Go in prayer. Now, at the end of the month, Catherine and I will be in Memphis, so we're going to divide this particular subject into three parts. We're going to look this morning at the idea of going to the throne of God, going before the throne of God with respect, with the proper respect. Next week, we will talk about going before the throne of God with the proper mind. And then we will conclude this study by looking at the proper heart. Prayer is one of the most important things in our life. In fact, it is so important that Paul would say in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 17, pray without ceasing. And as we look at the context, he says rejoice. He talks about the idea being here that we should be an individual, we should be a group of individuals that has a prayer on our lips at all times. Talking to God should be so commonplace with us that it is as easy as breathing, as easy as picking up the phone and calling your best friend, as easy as talking with your spouse. Now, obviously, it should be that easy. It should come to us that naturally, but that doesn't mean that we can approach God the same way that I would talk to my children, or the same way that I would talk to my wife. I cannot talk to God in the same manner. I cannot talk to God in the same manner I would talk to my parents even. There's much more involved in our avenue of prayer, in the way in which we approach God in prayer. Prayer is such an important subject that books have been written about it. Articles, sermons preached. Why? Well, because prayer is the means by which we can approach God. So this morning as we begin, let's look at going in prayer with the proper respect. The Lexham Biblical Dictionary says prayer was not unique to the Israelites of the early biblical period. Many cultures in the ancient Near East offer liturgical or ceremonial prayers and petitions to their deities. But it continues on and it says, however, the prayers of the Old Testament differ in many respects from those of the surrounding ancient Near East cultures. The biblical example of prayer portray Yahweh as a God who listens, not a deity who is distant or must be cajoled into attending the affairs of humanity. Our God listens. It reminds me of 1 Kings, how Elijah is offering up a sacrifice to God. The prophets of Baal are there. They are trying to summon their false god, and they cut themselves. They cry out all day they cry out, and Elijah says, well, maybe he's asleep. Maybe he's gone somewhere. Maybe, just cry a little bit louder. Mocking them. Because they understood, they knew the truth. Their God didn't exist. Their God could not answer. And yet God, He licked up the water in the ditch. He cleaned the burnt offering, consumed it with fire, and He showed that He answers prayers. We have such a great opportunity. It is so significant that we can go before the throne of God that we need to consider, how do we do that? What is involved with praying to God? Is over the years I have heard a variety of people say, hey, Daddy. Or they would say, yo, man upstairs. Or they would pray in such a way in which they're saying, oh, well, God's just my BFF. I can talk to Him any old way I want to. Is that what we see in the Bible? Does the Bible portray our conversation with God, our approaching His throne, as something that we can be flippant about? Or does it tell us that we need to be serious? That we need to be respectful in our prayer? In 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, God speaking of his people who have fallen away, who have stumbled, who are sinful. He says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal the land. Do you see the conditional aspect on God hearing? Now, Catherine asked me the other day, she was questioned. She goes, well, does that mean God doesn't hear children's prayers? And we talked about it, and I said, well, no, children are innocent. There's no sin there. And I said, the reality is God isn't that he does not hear the prayer of a sinner. It's God does not listen to that prayer. God does not answer the prayer of one who is not his. And obviously we understand that when our small children pray to God in their bed, their hearts are innocent, their souls are pure. And God absolutely hears those prayers. And if you want a lesson in humility and a lesson in respect, listen to a small child pray. Listen to how they try to include everything they can imagine in their prayers. God, I'm thankful for my mommy. I'm thankful for my daddy. I'm thankful for my big sister, my little sister. I'm thankful for my friends. I'm thankful. They never get tired of thanking God. Do we have such a heart? God says we need to humble ourselves. We need to seek his face. And then he'll hear. We continue. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 5, Jesus dealing with, again, the attitude towards prayer. He tells his disciples, and when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in synagogues and on the corners of streets, that they may be seen by men. I've heard some try to use this passage to teach, we shouldn't pray. If we're at a restaurant and, we're sitting down and there are people around, we shouldn't pray because we don't want to be seen. That's not what Jesus is saying. He says, do not pray. Do not approach the throne of God with the intention of drawing attention to yourself, with the purpose of letting others see how righteous you are. When we approach God, the point is not what others see. The point is not what others hear. The point is what I am doing, how I am approaching God. The point is that there's a conversation happening between me and my Father. And that should be the only consideration that I have. Humble yourself as you approach God. Approach God in a manner in which you are the focus. You're focusing solely on him. So we have two different verses that tell us very clearly there is a proper and an improper way to approach the throne of God. You can be haughty. You can be filled up with self-arrogance, self-importance. Or you can humble yourself. And you can approach the God of the Bible. You can approach the God who created you. You can approach God who is your Father with the proper respect. The Bible continues on as we look through the Old Testament. We see how people position themselves. The way in which we position ourselves says a lot about how we view or treat someone. If I'm walking through an area that I don't think is safe, and I have Catherine or the children with me, I stand a little bit straighter. I position myself to where I'm in front of them. I position myself. I put on an appearance of menacing, of being able to protect my family. When you are with people who you love and who care about you, you let your guard down. You are relaxed. So the way in which we hold ourselves says a lot about our attitude towards the individual we are around. So what do we see in terms of prayer? How do people approach the throne of God in the way in which they position themselves? In 1 Kings chapter 8, in verse 54, we read, "So it was when Solomon had finished praying all this prayer and supplication to the Lord, that he arose from before the altar of the Lord, from kneeling on his knees with his hands spread up to heaven." Solomon is kneeling before the altar. His hands are raised up, a common thing. In fact, Brother Ferguson, in his book, Church History, he talks a little bit in the introduction about how we got prayer the way it is. And he talks about Paul's letter and how Paul, talking to Timothy, tells them to lift up holy hands. And he says, look, lifting up hands isn't the significant part of the passage. He goes, the Greeks, the Romans, the pagans, the Jews, the Christians, he said all of them, that was the manner, that was the cultural appropriate way to pray to God. You lifted up hands. He said Paul here is telling them lift up holy hands. He says that's what's significant. So we understand that when Solomon's lifting up his hands, this is the traditional approach in which they prayed to God. They lifted up their hands. They looked up. He's positioned himself looking towards God. But he's on his knees. He has humbled himself. The King of Israel has dropped down to his knees. Do you know when you drop to your knees, it is a sign of submission? It is a sign of humility. It's a sign basically of begging almost. And Solomon did not start there. If you go back to verse 22 of 1 Kings chapter 8, what you're going to see is that Solomon begins, and it's a long prayer from verse 22 to verse 54. He begins this prayer standing. So I want you to picture this. Solomon is praying. He's talking to God. He is worshiping God in prayer. And in the middle of this prayer, as his heart is moved by the sincerity and the zeal, the love, the passion, the grace of being able to approach God, Solomon falls to his knees before the altar, so that in verse 54 we're told that at the end of the prayer he has to pick himself up. Do you see the respect in Solomon's prayer? Do you see how he has positioned himself in a form of humility, a form of humble praise to God? What about Jesus? You know, that's even more significant. In Matthew 26, verse 39, a prayer that is perhaps one of the most beautiful, significant, and heart-wrenching prayers recorded for us. In Matthew 26, verse 39, he went a little further. He fell on his face and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Now, there's a lot to unpack in this prayer, and this is a broken up prayer. We see that he prays it more than once. We see that he goes and he stops. He talks to his disciples. He goes back into prayer. And this is not even the entirety of the prayer. But Jesus is so emotionally drained, so emotionally distraught, that he falls on his face in prayer. You know, there are occasions in which we see, men trying to bow to angels, and the angels say, "Hey, don't bow to me, don't worship me." The Son of God, in approaching his Father, in begging, and that's what we see here, "Let this cup pass me. Do not make me die the horrific death on the cross." He has fallen to his face. He has humbled himself. You know, the Bible says that he learned obedience to death. Jesus submitted to the will of the Father. Not my will, but thine be done. And he shows us the proper attitude towards prayer, the proper way in which we should address God. Have you fallen on your face, crying in humble submission to God? God, forgive me. Have you been so moved by the needs of your heart that you submit yourself fully to God? You know, we don't make these gestures anymore. We don't bow to people. We sure better bow before God. We sure better humble ourselves that we fall on our face as we approach the throne of God and we petition Him with our needs. I want to look at one more section of passage. You see, we see that there is a way in which we can approach God. We see that there's a proper and an improper way to approach Him. We see that there is a way in which we can position ourselves. And I'm not saying that we need to fall on our face. I'm not saying that we need to get on our knees or that we need to lift holy hands. The whole idea here, again, is that there is a culturally accepted way to show submission, to show humility, to show God, I submit to you. And that when we approach the throne of God, we better show God that respect. We better humble ourselves and show God, I understand who you are. I understand what you are. I am coming to you as a child, desperately in need of you. In Luke chapter 11, we get a really fascinating encounter. See, Jesus has just finished praying. And his disciples have watched him. And we don't have the full context of when did John teach his disciples to pray? How did John do that? But what we're told is now it came to pass as he was praying in a certain place, when he ceased, that one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, as John also taught his disciples. Something about the way Jesus prayed moved his disciples. They said, Lord, teach us. We want to pray in the same manner you did. Maybe they saw the humility. Maybe they saw the way in which Jesus approached God and they said, you know what? There's something special there. So they tell Jesus, teach us to pray. I want to study the first part of the Lord's Prayer. The model prayer, as it should be more accurately titled. In Luke chapter 11, verses 2 through 3, we read, So he said to them, when you pray, say, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Now we understand, and I'll go ahead and get this out of the way so that no one thinks I'm trying to say we should pray this prayer. This prayer cannot be prayed in its entirety in the way in which Jesus presented it. God's kingdom is here. We are the church. We are the kingdom of God. I cannot pray, God, your kingdom come, because it has come. And to pray for the kingdom to come would be to pray for something that is erroneous. And it defeats the entire purpose, and it defeats the mind of the prayer. But what does Jesus show them? How does Jesus teach them to pray? He starts off by telling them, you address God properly. Our Father in heaven. What a beautiful concept. He doesn't say Yahweh in heaven. He doesn't say Creator in heaven. He doesn't say any number of other ways in which we could approach God. Lord in heaven. Master in heaven. He doesn't say anything else. He says our Father in heaven. He tells us this is a special relationship. You have this opportunity because you are children of God. And he says, approach the throne of God with that in mind. Our Father in heaven, hallowed, holy be your name. The very first thing that Jesus tells his disciples, when you pray to God, you offer praise. You offer worship to the holy name of God.